Officer down! I repeat, officer down!
Welcome back to 1033. This is your host, Nathan Kapler, a podcast created for a first responder by a first responder. If you are not a first responder, you still are welcome. This podcast is aimed directly at trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD is complex and often misunderstood. Our brave men and women who serve our communities often end up with behavioral and psychological issues as a result of experienced trauma from their careers. My goal is to share what I know, my personal experience with PTSD as a retired police officer, and continue to advocate for mental health while providing support to those still in their careers. This podcast is not a substitute for professional medical help, and I strongly suggest if you are in fact suffering, you seek out professional medical advice. Please join me on this episode as I continue to expose the reality of PTSD challenges. I hope you enjoy this week's episode. In last week's episode, we covered off how my time at Rehab was now coming to a close, and I was reflecting back on all of the things that I had learned. Learning how to ground the body was one of the most successful tools that I had now put on my tool belt. That was done through helping it nudge it along and getting the proper rest, the proper nutrition. Meditation was now something that I was doing daily, multiple times a day, to help it find peace, calm, and ease. Learning how to talk about my trauma and share the feelings behind the trauma and help it get processed also helped remove some of that stored trauma that was now sitting in the body for over a decade. I had relearned how to connect with others. I had learned about vulnerability, authenticity, sharing your feelings, feeling your feelings, and not running from them anymore. Sobriety itself was also a gift. It had allowed the body to heal without the aid of any substances. All of the band-aids, in essence, had finally been removed. We had now dealt with the root issue, the PTSD, the trauma, the childhood trauma. I learned that I was not alone, that many people over that time were now coming in behind me, new waves of first responders, all showing the signs of severe PTSD. And I watched them grow as well in those initial weeks while they were there. For many years, I thought PTSD was a made-up word, that someone should be able to control what they were going through, that this mental health stuff maybe existed, but not really, not at least not for me. Having had lived and gone through all of this, I now have the utmost respect for people that face challenges. I now understand mental health for first responders from a much deeper perspective. I also now recognize, too, a lot of us are victims. A lot of the trauma that we have experienced has now been stored within us and is slowly dragging us down over our years of service. This has less to do with controlling your mental health and trying to stay healthy, and has to do more with the fact that as more time goes on and the longer you are in a service life as a first responder, there is a high likelihood that you are going to fall victim to this. And there is no shame in that. When I first joined as a Mountie, people would thank me for my service. Some would go as far as to say thank you for your service and your sacrifice. Earlier on in my career, I didn't recognize or understand what that meant. I understood thanking me for my service. But my sacrifice? I haven't sacrificed anything. But what was really happening subconsciously was those sacrifices were already being made. The cost of service life was already happening. And it wouldn't be later on, almost 14 years later, when I would truly understand, even after rehab, just what that sacrifice looks like for some of us. So if you are serving your community in any type of role, first responder, social worker, teachers, whatever the case may be, thank you for your own service. And thank you for your own sacrifice, for there is always a cost to everything we do in life. Now, as my time was coming to a close with rehab, I actually faced fear. A fear of going back to reality. How was I going to do this? Was I going to be able to avoid medical cannabis? Was I going to need to have it in my life still to try and combat the symptoms? I had hopes that my symptoms had decreased enough that I no longer needed it. The seed, too, of addiction had been planted in rehab. I had many opportunities to reflect on what my addiction looked like, though I wasn't willing to share the depths of it with others or necessarily even admit it for myself. I did recognize that it was there. Going home, I told myself that I wanted to do this in the most natural state possible. No more cannabis. Use the tools that I had learned in therapy and continue to push myself forward in my own growth. Now, when I was in rehab, I was taught very early on, I can't remember if I spoke about this, but one of my therapists said to me, Nate, rehab is about discovery. When you go home, that is when recovery starts. And it was very true. When the moment came when I finally was able to leave rehab, I had an opportunity to speak in front of all of the peers that I had spent 6 weeks with. And I was overwhelmed with emotion, joy, peace, and calm, and gratitude for their support while I was there to help me, and for the opportunity that I had to be able to give back to them, to help them in their own journey. There were many people that I knew I was going to miss from that group. Many staff members that I knew I was going to miss. The appreciation I had for every single person that played a role in my success will not be forgotten. But this chapter did have to come to a close. The next chapter did need to start. I can remember coming home that day and walking back through the doors of my home and seeing the family that I had left behind. I was rocked in that moment with memories of how dark my journey had become and how tainted my view of life had also become. And when I walked back through those doors into my own home and saw the people that I loved, I also saw now the love that existed around me, the beauty that existed around me. I was absolutely timid in those moments coming home. I didn't know how to re-engage with loved ones. How do you start a conversation after rehab with loved ones? Where does that start? My family was there for me through it all, and I will never forget that. It took time for me now coming back to this environment to get acclimatized with life once more. There were many new firsts all over again, almost as if a newborn was first learning to re-experience this world through a new set of eyes, through a new perspective, with love now, and gratitude, and appreciation and thanks. I appreciated such small things now in this stage that I was rocked by emotion everywhere I went. Everything was new to me. An experience in the grocery store was new. The aisles were beautiful. I can remember looking down the aisles and being grateful to have food at my fingertips and the money to buy it. Not being in this chaotic, rushed state that we're usually in, I had time now to go slow and appreciate the things that were before me in this journey. Stopping to talk to complete strangers in the grocery store was something that had happened to me as well. And I also appreciated that moment of connection with a complete stranger. They had no idea what I had just been through. But if you stop and you listen to people and the words they say, they tell you a lot in those moments. For some of us that have the time to stop and listen to people, that's where we can build the best connection. Now, over time, there were definitely moments where I knew I needed to reach out to people that were now in my inner circle and start to rebuild those connections with them. Talk about all of the things that I had experienced in rehab. At first, I didn't want to talk about any of my experience in rehab. Not yet. It took me time. I was still guarded. I was still in this protective mode. Parts of me were still worried, too, that my employer would all of a sudden pull the rug out from underneath me and say, "You're fired. You're done. We're leaving you high and dry." There was a very big fear there as well. But as I continued to even have those conversations with work, they remained supportive. There were some issues along the way, do not get me wrong. There were some games that were being played, some things that were said that were not necessary and were completely insensitive towards me. That's fine. For the most part, they let me be in the driver's seat. I did have to push back at certain moments to let them know that they needed to back off. That my recovery was more important than their own organizational needs at this point. That I still needed time to heal through everything I had been through, to relearn this new way of being, to continue to recovery, to continue to build that foundation that was going to be key to my success. Over time, I began to build more comfort with re-engaging with connections with people, family, loved ones, friends, the neighborhood. I also began to challenge myself too in areas now, even at home, nutrition, meditation, working out, being more active, ensuring that I was looking after my mental health daily, journaling, talking about things with my wife and my family, the hard things that I had run from for years. As a man in the family, talking about my sadness, my fears, the things that I have lost over those years that I had ran away from. And all of the different things that I had seen through my journey of being a police officer, the stories I had never told, not once. I began to talk about them and began to feel them. And I allowed it to happen. And I processed those feelings. And I let them fade when they were ready to fade. And I began to heal. Even more so. Now, when I had returned home in 2019 in that fall, it was around September when I had come home, there was still a lot of work to be done. Work wanted me back to work right away, right after rehab. I think I left on a Sunday. They wanted me back on Monday. I had to say no to that. No was another very important thing that I had learned. Boundaries. Learning how to finally say no for the right reasons. Learning now about boundaries with work and letting them know what I needed in order to be successful. I knew I was not ready to go back to work immediately after rehab. And that was a hard thing to say, but I knew I had to say it, and I did. But coming home that fall and giving myself some time to continue in my recovery journey is exactly what I needed. I fired up group therapy now at home. I was re-engaged with the community. I was doing all of the things that I needed to do to stay healthy and stay connected. Now, if we all recall what happens after 2019 and 2020, that very spring, my recovery was going excellent. And then COVID came around. We were asked to socially isolate. We were asked to stay home. We were asked to not see people as this virus was now spreading throughout the world. We didn't know enough information about it, so we had to take this measure. My group therapy was shut down out of caution. I now was socially isolated from everyone that I needed in my life in order for my recovery to continue to be a success story. In this moment, that is where I relapsed. And my struggles became much more intense. The symptoms had come roaring back. I was completely alone once more, struggling in recovery, and now facing a relapse and using medical cannabis once more. And the lies I told myself when I had first started to use medical cannabis, because my symptoms now had started to increase. The sleep issues came back, the anxiety, all of the issues I've talked about in this season. I told myself, I have to be careful, I know that. But I should be able to control this. I need this in order to help me. To help with the anxiety, the panic attacks that had come back. Needless to say, as much as I was using it with trying to control it at the same time and control how much of it I was using, I was fighting a losing battle. And as that story continued, once again I started to fall back into stages of addiction. My use was increasing. The other issues were now coming back, the irritability, and the personal issues I had before. Now, oddly enough, with this all happening at the same time, I believe the RCMP for more or less was blown up in that everybody was sent home. I didn't really hear from anyone. I wasn't pushed on where I was at in my own recovery during that time. Everything was essentially shut down overnight. The world, in essence, had almost stopped. But as I started to fall further into addiction, that very seed that had been planted a while back in rehab somehow continued to grow. I had much more awareness now about my relationship with medical cannabis and some of the perils that existed if continued use continued to occur. At the same time as I was falling back into addiction, we had actually become pregnant with our second child. My daughter at that time would have been roughly about 3 years old as well, and she was flourishing. I still was an amazing father to her and had been the entire time. So that spring and summer, as my addiction grew and we grew closer to my son being born later that December, over that time I began to realize and recognize that this wasn't something that I could have in my life anymore, ever again. I didn't necessarily even have any issues with alcohol at that time, but I didn't like having a drink. I didn't like the way it made me feel anymore. Any substance that had any impact on me, I no longer liked. Yes, at that time I had still been using medical cannabis to deal with the symptoms, but it's almost like that devil and angel on your shoulder, the contrast worlds that exist within when you're facing addiction. You don't want to, but you do. It can be such a bizarre place, one that maybe doesn't make sense to a lot of people, until you live it and experience it yourself. That December, my son was born, and I can remember holding him for the first time, and I can remember the look that we had in that moment. I absolutely loved him. But I also had this look from him in that moment where I knew he was going to challenge me somehow. The only way I can explain it from my own perspective and my own experience in that moment was holding my son and looking down at him. I began to realize that I was getting older and that my ways were not always the right way. And that with him, I saw his strength and his power in that moment. I knew he was going to test me throughout his life. I knew he was going to challenge me. And it was going to be the exact thing that I needed most for my own growth. Girls and boys are so different. My daughter loves me, I know that much. She shows it. My boy does too. My daughter does not test me though. My son does. And I respect both of them for the way they are. And I try to meet them for who they are. But in that moment of recognizing now that my son had come into this world, and he needed me as a father, and he needed me to be a healthy individual, a healthy man, to show him how to live his best version of life. I knew in that moment that sobriety was the only way I was going to be able to do that for him. Now, this change didn't happen overnight. I didn't fully embrace sobriety until January, 1 month later. But as soon as January came, I told myself that was it. That was the end of the road with all substances, and that I needed to finally embrace sobriety. I knew in that moment that my physical, my mental, and my spiritual health, even my emotional, all depended on doing life this way now. And in order to be a good father, to give my kids those gifts so that they can have a successful life, this was the only way forward. At that same time, I knew I needed something else. I needed to fight this social isolation that was happening. I needed to challenge myself in new ways. I knew I needed to reshift the focus even a bit more. My physical health had begun to deteriorate once more. It had fallen out of a gym routine. It had fallen out of looking after myself. And I started to bring back these pillars. I signed up for high-intensity workouts, and I began pushing myself at home and doing these workouts at home. Brought nutrition back into my world. Began to refocus on the sleep, the important part of this journey. A major part of me facing relapse was the fact that group therapy had been shut down and we were now socially isolated. I knew I was going to have to challenge that. and I would have to form a new group somehow. I had never been on social media much as a cop over that decade, and a new platform had recently come out called TikTok. And oddly enough, I thought, you know what, I'm going to give this a shot. I'm just going to start posting about videos and awareness and having conversations around PTSD and see what happens. I knew the trolls that were out there were most likely going to chime in and try to cut me down where they could. I knew that a few people out there would probably support me in some way. They would understand the journey. And I began posting. And oddly enough, what I found was there was a very real community there that was too engaged with sobriety, that was engaged with having conversations around PTSD. The first responders were there, the ones that knew the pain and the suffering, the addiction, the suicide, and the mental health issues that exist from serving your community. They began listening and talking. And slowly, over a year, we built a community on TikTok of like-minded individuals. My group therapy was now flourishing, despite having to embrace social isolation. It was helping to keep me sober, along with my physical health now getting back into shape and the strength coming back, the flexibility, the movement in the body. All of these things were improving. The journey in my mental health as I embraced sobriety was slow. At times it was absolutely frustrating. The irritability remained despite being sober now. In the initial stages, I would get overwhelmed lots. I wasn't able to do much. I wasn't able to take on much, for that would cause me anxiety. I had to learn how to move extremely slow in the beginning, how to embrace this slower paced, more restful and recovery style of life. I began walking more and being more connected to nature, being outside more and working on my breathing as well. All of these little tools that I now had on my belt were helping my mental health significantly. As I had begun to embrace sobriety, I knew in that very moment that the reason I had gotten to this place was because of my childhood dream and becoming a police officer. And all of the experiences I had while I was a Mountie had contributed to this addiction. And I knew I had to make a decision. I could stay and fight and try to stay as a Mountie and go back to work. I knew I had to make a decision on what I felt was best for me, for my family. And oddly enough, that decision was incredibly easy to make. Because of everything that I had been through, everything that I had seen, everything that I had experienced, my final no, my final boundary that I needed to put in place was that I needed to tell the RCMP I was done with them. And I did just that. So that June of 2021, I signed my papers and I left. And it was one of the best decisions I have ever made in my life for myself. I had struggled for years with the idea of leaving, knowing that it ultimately was the very thing that I needed most. But the fear I held to take that plunge, to jump off of that cliff, kept me from doing it for so long. I knew if I didn't do it, I was going to lose my family. I was going to lose my children. Maybe not lose them, but ruin them. I wasn't prepared to do that. Not to continue to be a Mountie and to be proud and to serve my community. There is a cost to everything, and we all pay that cost. And you have to ask yourself those hard questions in this life. What does that cost look like to you? The day that I had to turn over all of my items, I thought I'd be sad. I wasn't sure really what to expect if I wasn't going to be sad. But I felt peace, and I felt joy. I knew giving this up was the right step, was the right thing for me and my healing journey. I was overwhelmed in that moment too, with a sense of gratitude for myself. I had finally done something for myself, something that pushed me to walk through my own fear, to challenge myself and what my identity was. to give up my childhood dream. What would people think of me? I had to embrace the fact that I needed to do this for me, and their opinions of what I was doing did not matter. I knew what was best for me. And they had a choice. They had a choice to support or not. And it was as simple as that. Now, because I had retired this way from home during a pandemic, I didn't really get much of an opportunity to say goodbye to the people that I had previously worked with, the ones that I had cared for. But again, I was shocked because over those course of the months, people had reached out, people had shown up, people had stopped and said thanks to me. And I was very grateful for that. I was grateful for those encouraging words, seeing those familiar faces, and an opportunity to say goodbye. Now, was I met with challenges post-retirement? Absolutely. I had to relearn my identity. I still have dreams of being a police officer years later. I still at times feel like I most likely am wired like one. There's a saying, once you are a blue, you are always a blue, and I do believe that. But at the same time, I also feel much more balanced, much more engaged with my community, in a better place all around. I have my sobriety to thank for that. And I have myself to thank for that, for the work that I've put in over the years to get to where I am now. Now, life has changed so much for me since even that point. We're now expecting our third child, and that will happen sometime in June. My family is flourishing. I am flourishing. My children are flourishing. And I've put so much of this behind me. It's now in the rear view mirror. I am always and will always be grateful to the Mounties for the experiences they have given me, for the things that they offered me, for how it pushed my life into this direction now, where I have the skills that I have. We have done as a family incredibly well financially. The supports that exist with a medical retirement are there. They are there to allow us to heal after a lifetime of service, to heal the post-traumatic stress, to transition back into whatever resemblance of a civilian life you can get to. Now, I will never be able to go back to the person I was before being a police officer, and I've accepted that. This new version of myself, I accept. How I've been able to get to a place now where I'm running a successful podcast, engaged with others that are on this journey too, fills me with gratitude and joy. Being able to give back to my brothers and sisters that are still serving in law enforcement or retired, to connect with the first responders that are in this world, serving their communities, and sacrificing and paying their own costs. I'm now able to give back to them. And what started out as group therapy has grown into a platform of community and connection, and hope and joy, and a belief that the pain that we go through as first responders, it will end once we learn how to end it ourselves, and to grow, and to have that post-traumatic growth. I consider myself to be a success story. Does that mean that my journey is without struggle? Absolutely not. I still take one day at a time. I still am grateful for my sobriety. I still do the things daily to make sure I stay healthy. I am a work in progress, and that's okay. Now, would I change any parts of my story? Absolutely not. This journey was meant to happen exactly the way it happened. This journey led me to the place that I'm at right now. And there was only one way to get here. Am I filled with shame, regret, or guilt about any of it? Absolutely not. I've learned to fully accept everything that's happened in my life. There's a reason why everything happens to you in your life. Some of it is within your control, yes. Some of it is not. The things that are not in your control, you need to learn how to accept, how to work with it, how to grow with it. Even as I sit here in this moment, the very thing I ran from for so many years, which was my story, my experience, I'm recognizing in this moment that I finally just shared it. I've told it in its entirety. I've gone deep, incredibly deep, in this project to give and to help others, to give back, but also challenge myself too. We all need to tell our story. It's incredibly freeing. It's something I hope that we can all experience at least once in our life. to be able to tell our story, the real version, without the ego involved, without the masks. So where does my journey go from here? So before we dive deeper into what is most likely going to be this season's last episode next week, we're going to break here. I'm going to thank you once more for being a part of my journey, for being a part of my success story. And I hope in some way I can be a part of yours as well. Much love. I hope you enjoyed this last episode. As we continue to grow, I would appreciate your support. Please consider subscribing to the podcast on your favorite streaming platform. Leave a comment or a review and share this with anyone that you may know may benefit from what we are discussing. Have a great week, and as always, thank you for tuning in.